Good evening, everyone. My name is Eric Eichhoff, and I serve as the Associate Director of Alumni Relations at John Carroll University. Thank you for joining us this evening for our next installment of ACES, the Alumni Continuing Education Series. ACES was established in the spring of 2013 by the Office of Alumni Relations in the spirit of lifelong learning. The program offers enrichment opportunities for alumni and friends through the expertise of members of the JCU administration, faculty, and alumni community. As a result of COVID-19 and our inability to connect with all of you in person, we've moved all of our programming online. Over the past 7 months, we've heard from experts on ethics and leadership, the political impact of COVID and economic impact of COVID-19, racial equity and social justice, space exploration, the brewing industry, and the women's suffrage movement, just to name a few. Tonight, we will learn more about the United States' complicated history with Civil War monuments and statues, especially those erected to memorialize the Confederacy. This program will explore the reasons these monuments were erected, how they have served as flashpoints in our society, and why there's been an increased call for the removal of these monuments in the wake of this summer's focus on social justice and racial equity. Our community is incredibly fortunate to have an expert in this topic. Before I introduce tonight's guest speaker, I'd like to provide you some tips for tonight's program. Please use the full screen option to view tonight's program. If you have thoughts or questions for our presenter, please use the chat feature. Following the structured portion of the program, I will curate questions from the chat and pose them to our guest. It is now my pleasure to introduce our featured speaker for tonight's program. Dan Kilbride, PhD, is a professor of history at John Carroll University, where he has taught since 1997. He specializes in the history of the American South and American cultural history. His latest book, Being American in Europe, 1750 to 1860. Please join me in welcoming Dan Kilbride. Dan, it's great to see you tonight. Thanks for joining us.
Unmute. There you go. I should know better than that. You got to unmute. But it says I'm muted again. I don't know. Can you all hear me? Because I'm getting a message on the screen that says I am muted. Okay, excellent.
We can hear you.
Cool. All right. Well, it's wonderful to be here. As I scroll down the list of participants, I see some familiar names, bringing back some good memories, maybe some bad memories as an instructor. I won't name names though. So as I said, it's great to be here, and I'm really delighted to discuss this topic. It happens on one of the classes I'm teaching this semester is one I've taught since I've come to John Carroll, which is called the Old South, which covers the American South from the time of its founding through Reconstruction. And one of the activities that I'm doing in class, having to be very creative this semester on Zoom, is the very last thing in lieu of a final exam. I'm going to have the students write a short reflective essay on the controversy over Confederate monuments. So I think I'm going to have them read the 538 article that I think Eric distributed to you today. And there's also a film that's just come out on Confederate monuments. It's a little quirky, but I think it's an interesting hour-long film. So this is something that I've been thinking a lot about recently, just to have students reflect on the modern meaning of the Old South and the Confederacy in our contemporary period. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to share my screen. I hope you can see this, my Google slideshow. I'm going to give what is a brief, I hope will be a brief presentation. I hope I don't speak for more than 20 minutes. But like a lot of professors, I have a tendency to just yak on and on and on. I'll try to restrain myself from doing that today. And I want to talk about Confederate monuments, where they came from, what the different things they mean to different people. They have a very peculiar history. And as the background to this slideshow, I hope suggests, they're a real cultural flashpoint right now in our country's history. I think the controversy over Confederate monuments and the Confederate flag and other symbols of the Confederacy is a reminder that as much as in an election season, as much as we like to focus on things like the economy and foreign policy and issue-driven things, that in American culture or American politics, and this is probably true of any country's politics, cultural issues are at least as resonant for many, many people than bread and butter issues like jobs, taxation, the economy, diplomacy, foreign policy, etc. And this is maybe the cultural issue of our moment right now. And this is something that's been an issue for a long time. I mean, this is the issue of the appropriateness of monuments to the Confederate States of America, a would-be country whose mission was to separate from and to destroy the United States of America in the name of perpetuating slavery, was an issue that resonated as soon as the war ended. 1866 was the first Confederate Memorial Day, which was controversial to memorialize and honor and recognize the lives of people who sought to separate from and to destroy the United States of America. So this is something that goes back a long time. But as you're going to see, there have been some flashpoints in this history. And one of those flashpoints occurred in 2015. This is a picture of Dylan Roof. Dylan Roof was the 21-year-old young man who in June of 2015, murdered 9 parishioners in a church in Charleston, South Carolina. And Dylan Roof, as I said, was a troubled young man, and this picture kind of reflects that. But Dylan Roof liked guns and he liked the Confederacy. He was somebody who a lot of his social media accounts were filled with Confederate images and Confederate memorabilia. And it was really after that shooting and the shock waves that it sent across the country, where we had an unapologetic racist, an unapologetic Confederate, nationalist. This is really the time when the reckoning with Confederate statues, Confederate memorabilia, the Confederate flag. This is really what this became almost like a critical mass. And, as I said, Americans had been thinking about this for a long time. This is not a new issue, but the murders of those people at the hands of this young man really raised this issue to the front ranks of issues in American life. And so this is something that, and of course, over this summer, with the murder of George Floyd and controversies regarding violence between police departments and African-American populations, with the Proud Boys in Charlottesville, Virginia, in the early years of Donald Trump's first term. These issues have continued to be on the front pages of our country. And so this is something that really resonates today, and it's not going away. Let's talk about the background, where this kind of comes from. As I said, the issue of recognizing the Confederacy, memorializing the Confederacy has a really long period. And as the article in 538 discussed, there are really 2 eras in American history where fetishizing or memorializing the Confederacy really spiked in terms of the erection of statues, the display of the Confederate flag, the naming of schools and roads and towns and American military bases for Confederate leaders. And one of those times was between the decades, the 1890s and the 1920s. This was really, I would say, the high point of Confederate memorialization. And there are a number of reasons for this, but one of them is suggested by these photographs. These photographs were taken at the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. And they demonstrate, or they visualize the reconciliation between the North and the South, the veterans of the Union and the veterans of the Confederacy. So on the left-hand side, you see the Confederate veterans shaking hands with Union veterans over what was in 1863, the wall at Cemetery Ridge, that during the third day of the Battle of Gettysburg, the Confederates were repelled. And you see this symbolized on the right-hand photograph. You see these two old geezers, shaking hands and basically burying the hatchet of the Civil War, putting the Civil War behind them. And this there's a lot of literature about the reconciliation between the North and the South, which did not occur during Reconstruction. Reconstruction was a very contentious period in American history where there wasn't a lot of forgiveness. But in the 1880s, 1890s, a lot of Americans decided that it was important to put the Civil War behind them. And to do that, it was necessary to selectively forget a lot of things about the Civil War, such as what the Civil War was about. The Civil War was about restoring or preserving the United States as an integrated country, punishing treason, making sure that you couldn't just throw a hissy fit if you lost a presidential election and just leave the United States. That eventually the Civil War is a war to exterminate slavery and get rid of that from American life. And these people in this period sort of selectively forgot all those things and invented a civil war that was all about military exploits, that everybody was brave, everybody was courageous, whether you fought for the North and the South. And we're just going to forget about unpleasant things like treason and slaveholding and atrocities and stuff like that. And so this is one of the eras in which the Confederacy is able to come back into a state of semi-respectability, because many, many Northerners are really not willing to kind of dredge up all that unpleasantness, because they want to move on from the Civil War. They want to do other things. And they don't think it's worthwhile to dredge up all these unpleasant memories about slavery and treason. Now, there are a lot of Americans who don't agree with that at all. Frederick Douglass, for example, made this his mission in life. But a significant number of Northerners and a very large number of white Southerners certainly did. This is also, of course, the 1890s and the 1920s, the era of what is called Jim Crow. I know the photograph on the left-hand side is shocking and unpleasant. So here's my trigger warning. I guess I should have said something in the previous slide. This is the era of Jim Crow, the era in which white Southerners systematically created a situation in which African-American peoples, the vast majority of whom lived in the South, relegated them to second-class citizenship. They did this in a number of ways. The so-called Jim Crow laws, things like colored water fountains and waiting rooms in bus and train stations, one for people of color, one for white people, school segregation. I mean, the list goes on and on. I'm sure you've heard this before. They did this by terror, and lynching is a form of terrorism. You see the white people in this photograph, obviously with no fear at all of retribution, no fear that somebody's going to arrest them for hanging these two black men. The message of lynching, of course, to black people is that nobody is coming to help you. You live at the mercy of white people in the South, and you better not cross that invisible line that we've erected to separate white from black, right? And of course, there's other things too, such as disenfranchisement, the way that the Southern states systematically disenfranchised African-American voters by circumventing the 15th Amendment to the Constitution. Things like convict leasing, by which black men were randomly arrested and sentenced to long sentences of hard labor, usually for trumped up crimes, right? And there's a very close connection between the Jim Crow era and the erection of Confederate monuments. This is the era in which that happens in just enormous numbers. That you see, there's roughly something like 1,100 Confederate monuments that have been erected over time. And most of them were erected in two periods, in this period and then in the 1950s. But this period was the sort of golden age of Confederate monuments. And the message of those monuments was that we, that is the white South, we are going to celebrate the Confederacy. And there's nothing you can do about it. That nobody is coming to help you. That we're going to glorify people like Robert E. Lee. We're going to glorify Stonewall Jackson. We're going to glorify people like Nathan Bedford Forrest. And we don't really care what you think. A really strong message about that. That was something that there's a reason why this is not just a correlation. There's a causal relationship between these two things. The most popular monuments, by the way, are in general, there's sort of a general Confederate veteran there's almost every courthouse in the South has a Confederate veteran statue that's just sort of a generic person. But as you might expect, the most popular individual memorials are Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, Stonewall Jackson, and then you get to people you may or may not heard of, like P.G.T. Beauregard, Jeb Stuart, and unbelievably, Nathan Bedford Forrest, a Confederate veteran, but also the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. This is really the era in which you really see the erection of these statues all over the South, and in some places in the North as well, which I'll talk about in a second. It's not really just the South. So that it's really important to pay attention to timing here, because the timing of the erection of these memorials tells you a lot about why they were erected. It's not random. It's to send a message to Black Southerners to stay in your place. This is an interesting memorial. This is the memorial set up in Arlington National Cemetery. So the United States Military Cemetery to the Confederacy. And this was erected by the United Daughters of the Confederacy in 1914. It was commissioned in 1896, but it took a while to raise the money and then to erect the statue. I probably should have showed you the whole statue first, but I'm going to show you some detail, which I think is really interesting here. And I'm going to use some annotation, some funky stuff here. So notice two things here in this image. Tells you a lot about how white Southerners were trying to, do a little revisionist history with the Confederacy. So for example, what you see here is a Confederate soldier saying goodbye to his family, his children. But notice the woman. This is an enslaved woman, obviously. So what we see here is the myth of the happy slave, that enslaved African Americans in the South were, according to this vision of history, the happiest servant population on earth. The myth of the happy slave, that the North, the Union, in destroying slavery, destroyed the natural relationship between people of color and the Anglo-Saxon race, right? So you see the happy slave in this image. And there's a number of other memorials to the happy slave. There's another one that is really even more egregious here. I don't know if you could point it out, but here you see amidst all these Confederate soldiers, an African-American soldier, right? You've probably heard people make the claim that there are Black Confederate soldiers, that Black Southerners willingly and happily fought for the Confederacy. We can talk about that later if you want, but I'll just say that claim is absolute garbage. And it's a myth. It's ideology. What you see in this image is this image of the so-called lost cause, that the South were the really good guys, that their civilization was more advanced than the North, that you had warm and happy relations between slaves and their masters. So happy, in fact, that African-American slaves marched willingly and enthusiastically in the ranks of the Confederate Army, which they didn't. Let me get out of this annotation. Here you see, this is the full statue in Arlington National Cemetery, Our Dead Heroes. And as you see here, I don't know if you can read this, but it was erected by the United Daughters of the Confederacy, this institution that was responsible for Confederate Memorial Day, a women's organization that primarily raised funds and put up hundreds of memorials for Confederate soldiers all around the country. I should point out that there were about 1,800. I don't know what number I said before, but it's about 1,800 memorials. About 100 have been removed in the past 10 years. 1,700 or so remain. Most of them in 3 states. Most of these memorials are in Georgia, Virginia, and North Carolina. Just a few quick things. There are 103 K through 12 schools named for Confederate veterans. Again, usually Lee, Davis, Stonewall Jackson, etc. There are 3 universities named for Confederate veterans, such as Washington and Lee University. And there's also 9 state holidays in over 5 states that are for Confederate holidays. In fact, the states of Alabama and Mississippi have 3 separate holidays honoring state holidays where state employees are off, memorializing and honoring Confederate veterans. And to this day, there are 10 military bases across the United States also named for Confederate veterans. There's also some of these statues in states that did not join the Confederacy. I'm sorry, this is not one of those. This is one of those generic memorials to the generalized Confederate soldier. This is in Nashville, Tennessee, and as you can see, this sort of epitomizes the lost cause that I just talked about, in the sense that it really doesn't say anything about the causes of the war. It simply says, that the Confederate veterans, the comrades, as it says here, that they were all brave, self-sacrificing, that they fought gloriously against overwhelming odds, and for a cause that was lost. So most of these memorials don't make any sort of overtly political statement, but what they do is they sort of sanitize the Civil War. So this is one that's still standing outside of a school in Nashville, Tennessee. You also see the Confederate flag down there. Looks like a cake almost. As I said, there are Confederate memorials outside of the Confederate states. This one on the left-hand side here is in Louisville, Kentucky. Some people might not know that Kentucky, even though it was a slave state, remained loyal to the United States during the Civil War and supplied tens of thousands of troops to the United States armies. The statue on the left, honoring Confederate women, is in Baltimore, Maryland, and it's still there. So again, Maryland, a slave state, also remained loyal to the United States during the Civil War. So there are these memorials that are outside of the Confederacy, and interestingly, there's a couple of Confederate memorials in California. I tried to keep this slideshow short, so I didn't track those down, but there are a couple in states that were free, and at least what you might say in terms of Kentucky on the left and Maryland on the right, that at least they were slave states, but there are memorials there anyway. So it's curious to me that in states that remain loyal to the Union, there are nevertheless Confederate memorials. I don't have a feeling I might have skipped a slide there. Nope. There are also a lot of Confederate memorials at Gettysburg. And here are 2 from the battlefield in Gettysburg. And by the way, just a few numbers that I see on a slide here that I mentioned. There are 24 Confederate monuments in Kentucky. There are 13 in Missouri, another slave state that remained loyal to the Union. And I was fascinated by this statistic that I found. There are 9 Confederate memorials in West Virginia. And the reason I find that so interesting is because, West Virginia was the one state that consciously, actually, not only did it remain loyal to the Union, it had to secede from its own state, Virginia, to remain loyal to the United States. And yet there are 9 Confederate memorials in what you might consider to be the ultimate loyal state, West Virginia. It's just absolutely bizarre. So here are 2 of these memorials in Gettysburg. So you see on the left-hand side, the Mississippi Memorial. The guy with the swinging the gun is not hitting the guy on the ground. He's actually protecting him, protecting the flag bearer. and of course the Georgia State Memorial on the right. There are, I don't have a count of these, but there are a lot of Confederate memorials. Some are generally state memorials, some are particular regimental memorials. And they date from 1886, the earliest one. It was memorializing an individual, and then the last one being the year 2000. But the majority of these memorials on the Gettysburg battlefield were erected between 1900 and 1920. Again, the high point of memorializing the Confederacy in this time period. More recently, there are some memorials and flying the Confederate flag in the North. And this is a memorial outside of Cincinnati, Ohio, to Robert E. Lee. And you see this memorial has been defaced. This was about a year ago that this memorial was spray painted. But again, you see here on the left-hand side the way that the Confederate memorials have been politicized. You see this, Robert E. Lee, we do not negotiate with terrorists. Black Lives Matter is a terrorist organization, urging people to respect the Confederate memorial. A number of states have passed memorial protection laws. Alabama and North Carolina have done so in the past 2 or 3 years. And there are some states that have had protection statutes on the books for a long time, basically saying that you cannot remove these memorials. As I said, about over 100 Confederate memorials, statues, et cetera, have been removed in recent years. The Confederate flag also factors into this. The other big spike in Confederate memorials was in the 1950s and 1960s. It doesn't take a genius to figure out why. That's the high point of the civil rights movement, when again, Southern state legislatures wanted to make a point. So for example, it was not until 1961 that the state of South Carolina flew the Confederate flag above the South Carolina Capitol. That's not an accident. They were making a statement. And a number of Southern states actually changed the design of their state flags during the civil rights movement to include the Confederate battle flag, which was not there before. Again, timing is absolutely crucial here. And to wrap up here, I know I've gone over a lot of material very quickly, for which I apologize. This is still going on. This is a political flashpoint today. So here is photographs of the so-called Unite the Right rally from, I forget whether it's 2016 or 2017, that centered over the controversy over the statue of Robert E. Lee at the University of Virginia, proposals to remove it. And some, very fine people, I'm told, oppose this. Here you see some of these very fine people carrying Confederate flags, Tea Party flags, and also Nazi flags. So that's something. And you see some of the anger and the hatred that many of these people were carrying with them. So the Confederate flag, just to conclude here, you'll often hear from people who defend or endorse the flying of the Confederate flag saying something like, for me, the Confederate flag represents heritage, not hate. It represents, for people who grew up in the South, whose ancestors are from the South, that this is their heritage, this is their history. And you're trying to erase, you're trying to cancel my history. You're trying to cancel history by taking down statues. Of course, statues aren't history. I teach history all the time, and that's not going away. I was talking to a colleague of mine the other day who said sometimes people will say the same thing about Auschwitz. They'll say, well, why should we take down statues to Robert E. Lee? Because the Germans, the Poles, have not taken down Auschwitz or Dachau, which are at least or even more shameful than the Confederate flag and statues of Robert E. Lee. The point is, of course, that the Germans let those concentration camps stand precisely because they want to remind people of the shame of the Holocaust. They're not a celebration. It's regret. It's shame. The people who erect statues of Robert E. Lee and fly the Confederate flag, they're not ashamed of it. They're proud of it. It's a big difference. And I am sure, to get back to my point, I do believe that many of the people who fly the Confederate flag, there are people, of course, there are these racists here, but there are people who have no idea what the Confederate flag symbolizes. They have no idea the Confederate flag symbolizes the perpetuation of slavery and treason to the United States government. But that comes from a place of ignorance of history. Sometimes it's a desired or willing ignorance. But some people, fair enough, they don't realize that the Confederate flag represents that for people of color in particular, it represents the darkest periods of their history. Again, the failure of our educational system, the failure of history and civics education, that people can believe that something represents heritage and not hate, when the briefest glance at the historical background would indicate that it in fact does represent hate. That is its literal foundation. So I try not to judge people. We live in a very judgy time who make that argument, but it does come from a place of ignorance about the background of these things. I wanted to talk for 20 minutes. As I said, we professors, we yak on and on. It's been almost 35 minutes. So I'm going to stop, and I'm going to, I'll be happy to take your questions and take your comments. I'm going to stop sharing this right now.
Well, thanks, Dan. Thanks so much for that in-depth dive into Confederate monuments and their history and why so many of them were put up. I have a couple questions, and we're going to get right into the people who have joined us this evening as well. And we have some really good questions there too. One of the things I was a history major, and one of the things I've always heard and learned about was that Robert E. Lee was really, really against monuments. And in doing some research for our conversation, I uncovered that he was actually invited to a memorial celebration at Gettysburg. And he had said, this is a quote of his, and I'll put it in the chat: "My engagements will not permit me to be present. I believe if there, I could not add anything material to the information existing on the subject. I think it wiser, moreover, not to keep open the sores of war, but to follow the examples of those nations who endeavor to obliterate marks of civil strife, to commit to oblivion the feelings engendered." What do you think Robert E. Lee would say about all that's going on within our society around Civil War monuments and, and the conversations going on about them?
Yeah, I think the date of that statement by Robert E. Lee was something 1868, 1869.
Yep.
Actually, right at the end of Lee's life. Again, the timing is critical here. Now, at the time, this is during Reconstruction, probably the most contentious era in American history, right? And Lee was anxious, for Lee, the war was over, right? The South had lost, the Confederacy had lost, right? Jefferson Davis had desired the Confederacy to move on from Appomattox to wage a guerrilla war, run off to the hills and fight the Union Army like the Viet Cong, And Lee wanted none of that. He's like, look, we lost the war. Defeated armies, it's over. We're not going to fight a guerrilla war. And so Lee, he drank the cup of bitterness. He drank the cup of defeat. And he said, we're done here. And it's our job now to reconcile with our Northern brothers and sisters. And Lee believed that in this period of the war, that 3 years after the Civil War, that erecting Confederate monuments would only reopen the wounds that he was very anxious to heal. And so Lee, Lee wasn't opposed to Confederate monuments in 1890 and 1900 because he was dead. Who knows what he would have said? I always hate those kind of counterfactual questions. But so the time we're talking about is very, very important, where Lee was like, we need to move on and reconcile and get back as one country and move into the future. And that these memorials at this time would damage that goal.
Thanks. I think he's so revered in the South. It's interesting to hear that perspective. I know you mentioned Gettysburg as well, and we had some questions. One was from Mike Hardy about like monuments at national parks, and I know a couple of years ago, George Villaganis took us on a trip to Gettysburg, and we actually had hoped to do it again this year until COVID struck. And in his, we walked through the battlefield and just saw so many of the monuments that were there. And I think Gettysburg has roughly a fifth of all the Civil War monuments on a battlefield. But you had started mentioning some of the states that were putting up monuments. Was that specifically due to things like the Civil Rights Movement? I saw that somewhere in the 60s, or the High Wire Walk of the Confederacy. I don't think other battlefields have those as much. Is that something unique to the Gettysburg?
Well, I mean, Gettysburg is by far the most visited Civil War park. I mean, it's practically right off the Pennsylvania Turnpike. So, it's very easy to get to from Baltimore, Philadelphia, or Pittsburgh. Like Antietam is almost like a ghost town compared to it. And so I think that's why, and Gettysburg, there's a whole mythology around Gettysburg, the so-called turning point of the Civil War and all that nonsense. And so Gettysburg, there's this huge mythology around Gettysburg. So, but again, as I said, that those memorials go back to as early as 1886 to 2000. But again, the critical mass of construction for Confederate memorials at Gettysburg was 1900 to 1920. That's when most of those memorials were built. Now, again, I'm not sure that most of those memorials were designed to be sort of a middle finger to African Americans, because there's not a whole lot of African Americans living around Gettysburg. But certainly it was a symbol of Southerners insisting that they deserved respect in the United States and that they were not going to back down from arguing that the Confederacy might have lost the war, but they were fighting the righteous fight.
Thank you. I'm going to just jump right into some of the questions that have come in, because we have a lot of them.
Let me just real quick, address Rory O'Neill. Rory, a former student who was in the Old South class asking about the duels, right? So Rory, the problem with I have my class fight duels in my Old South class because, long story short, Southern men fought duels. How am I going to do it on Zoom? I had people, as Rory will remember, I had people in teams or in groups. They write out a script and they act it out in class. So I'm doing it this year, but I'm just doing the script. I can't have people act it out. The logistics are impossible. So it's a bummer, but I still wanted to do it. So.
Pat Harris asks, were the monuments that were erected to the Confederacy mostly done by state governments, or were those from private organizations?
Most of them have been done by private organizations. Now, some you will find in almost every county courthouse in the South a monument to the sort of anonymous Confederate soldier. And sometimes those monuments were erected by the county. Now, monuments like the Virginia State House, the Mississippi State House are going to be erected by the state government. But most of these were erected by private organizations like the United Daughters of the Confederacy, the Sons of Confederate Veterans, raising private funds. One thing that Americans are really good at is organizing and setting up organizations and fundraising. And even in a relatively cash poor economy like the American South after Reconstruction, they were still able to do this. Although it did take a long time, that as I said, that memorial at Arlington National Cemetery took 28 years from the time it was commissioned to the time it was actually built, most of it due to slow fundraising.
Mark Schreiner asks, he said, great presentation, and he had a question on the issue of heritage versus history. And could you talk more about the idea that the lost cause memorials are not historical artifacts, but as the AHS charges actually attacks on the idea of fair historiography?
Well, I'm not sure what the AHS is referring to there. Read the first part of that question for me again, please.
Sure. Could you talk about the idea that lost cause memorials are not historical artifacts?
Okay. Well, I mean, I think they are historical artifacts. I think if you put them in the historical context that I've tried to do, they are historical artifacts. So we have sort of an argument in our society that some people say that we are canceling history by removing these monuments. But we're not canceling history. We are removing historical artifacts, or those who advocate removing or defacing, in some cases, these memorials are doing so to dishonor these memorials. I don't know many people who argue that statues of Robert E. Lee should be melted down and rebuilt into statues of Frederick Douglass, but maybe they should be put in a museum where there can be an exhibit that puts their history into context, because that's completely missing from these memorials wherever they are. There's hardly any, to my knowledge, that actually say, okay, this is when this was built, and this is the context of when it was built, and this is who built it, and this is what they were trying to do. So I think that they are historical artifacts. I don't think they're history.
Another question was, how did Union veterans feel about Confederate monuments, especially on battlefields where, they fought and many of them died protecting the Union?
Yeah, there's a number of you, just looking at the chat really quick, have been asking for sources and the bibliography. Just a second. So here's a great book. It's called Remembering the Civil War by Allison Janney. Carolyn Janney. Allison Janney's an actress. And it's a great book. I used it in my Civil War class a couple of years ago. And it makes the point that, oh, damn, what was the question?
How did Union soldiers feel about Confederate monuments going up on battlefields?
So, as I mentioned before, some Northerners were sort of anxious, at a certain point in history to kind of move on from the Civil War, to kind of put, the anger and the controversy and the recriminations behind us. So let's move on. Let's move on into the 19th and 20th centuries. And again, that required kind of forgetting about things like slavery and treason and atrocities and things like that. And there were a lot of Northern, especially Northern veterans, who said, hell no. We did not, my colleagues did not bleed, and some of them die, so we could forget about why we fought the war to begin with. Nobody fights a war for fun. Nobody fights a war for kicks. We fought this war, many Northern veterans said, to preserve the United States, the only democracy in the world that the Confederacy was seeking to destroy. We eventually fought a war, not originally, but it became this, to abolish slavery, a great stain on the United States. And we are not going to forget about those things for the sake of reconciliation. So this was not a consensus by any means in the North. There were many Northerners who said, there were good guys and there were bad guys, and we should never forget who those people were. And as I mentioned, a little while ago, Frederick Douglass was relentless at the end of his life in the 1880s, 1890s, in reminding Northerners that the Civil War meant something. The Civil War was about something. There's a really great book by David Blight, who just wrote a biography of Frederick Douglass called Remembering the Civil War. Frederick Douglass Remembering the Civil War, who talks about this. I think the book's actually a little repetitive, but he makes this point that Douglas, this was his mission in life, to remind Northerners that they were the good guys and they should be proud of it.
Edward Bach asked if there was any reason or pattern to whose statue was erected at county courthouses or government buildings or cemeteries, or was it just kind of the local jurisdiction that chose who got to go where?
Yeah, well, obviously different states tend to honor their state heroes, like, not most, but a plurality of statues of Robert E. Lee are in Virginia. Nathan Bedford Forrest, his stuff tends to be in Tennessee and so forth. Those statues and those memorials at county courthouses in southern town squares, they tend to be sort of the anonymous Confederate soldier, just sort of symbolizing not a particular individual by name, but just some person to venerate the local, like sort of the Soldiers and Sailors Monument downtown, which honors Ohio and Cleveland Civil War soldiers in general, not a particular one. Those monuments tend to memorialize the quote unquote Confederate soldier in general. But yeah, there's definitely particular states and state capitals tend to honor their state, their state heroes. Like, I don't know this for sure, but I suspect that the monuments to PGT Beauregard are concentrated in Louisiana, because why else would you memorialize that guy?
Paul Podgman, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your last name, was wondering if you could share some comments on why Reconstruction didn't necessarily solve all the problems it was supposed to.
Oh man, are you kidding? That's a course, man. Take my course next semester. Reconstruction was a disaster. I mean, it was, compared to the Civil War, compared to Reconstruction, the Civil War was easy. Because at least there was a identifiable goal and a lot of support behind it. But Reconstruction was basically putting Humpty Dumpty back together again, and dealing with the aftermath of slavery, which was, okay, we know that these 4 million people, they're not slaves anymore, but what are they? Are they going to be citizens, which eventually was what was done? Or are they going to be some kind of, you can imagine like some kind of South Africa solution, some kind of apartheid, which might have been erected. So those questions, especially the question about what is the status of African Americans, were enormously controversial. And the white South was willing to accept defeat. They were willing to accept the end of slavery, because what were they going to do about it? But they never wavered in their support or their demand that white supremacy remain the law of the South. And that was the crux of sort of the struggle between the North, especially the Republicans, whose commitment to racial equality was shaky, versus the white South, whose commitment to white supremacy was absolute. And it's that sort of struggle that helped make Reconstruction so contentious and angry. I just wrote an article that's going to be published in a couple of months about the white South's absolute determination at all costs to retain white supremacy. I won't bore you with the details, but it was crazy. Sometimes I tell my students, I thought I saw Anthony Haas on this list. Sometimes I joke, not a great joke, but that maybe the best thing that ever happened to Abraham Lincoln's reputation was that he was assassinated in 1865 and never really had to deal with Reconstruction. Because Reconstruction, nobody comes out looking good. Ulysses S. Grant, his reputation is coming back, but for a while he was in the mud of history too, because Reconstruction entailed a lot of compromises and and Lincoln, who knows? I mean, if anybody could have navigated Reconstruction, maybe it would have been Lincoln. But I think that his reputation would not be nearly, I mean, he's as close as it gets to a secular saint in American civic life. But I think it would be seriously tarnished if he had survived and had to navigate through Reconstruction. It would have been bad. Yeah. That's not even a beginning to answer that question. But as I said, Reconstruction is so unbelievably complicated.
Sure, it is for sure. So you mentioned Lincoln and Grant, and obviously there are monuments all over the place to those men as well as others. And I guess this would go to the monuments to the Confederacy. Are we doing our society a disservice by not putting them into the proper contextual context, where like all the information behind them, as opposed to just memorializing certain aspects of their character or thought?
I mean, I would love for that to happen, for there to be, I think this argument has been very unsophisticated. It's been you tear down the statues or keep them up and valorize people as heroes. And there's been very little, not many voices who said, let's really understand the context of these things, understand where they come from, and helped us understand our history. Because I really think if you study these monuments, you understand Reconstruction. You understand the era of Jim Crow and lynching and disenfranchisement. It helps you understand the strategies of Southern conservatives during the Civil Rights Movement. So I would love to see less anger on both sides, even if I think that the anger on one side is a righteous anger. I think anger it doesn't encourage you to count to 10 and really kind of understand things. So I hope that some of these monuments will be moved into a context like a museum or the grounds of a museum, where they can be, where the people who are professionals in public history can help the public understand their background. I hope that happens. I am not optimistic that will happen, but it would be great.
You had mentioned that at Gettysburg, there was a monument that was put up in 2000, which seems incredibly late to be putting up a monument to a member of the Confederacy. Do you remember who that was and what the?
It's a Confederate regiment.
Okay.
So it's a Confederate military unit. But I don't remember which one it is. So it's not put to a particular person. It's not honoring a particular officer, but it's to a Confederate regiment. There's a lot of those regimental, both for the Union and the Confederacy at Gettysburg.
In your Kelly asks about that some of the monuments have been taken down, but many still exist, including here in Ohio. And I know you briefly talked about the fact that there are these monuments in northern states. Was that? I think there's a Confederate cemetery out near on Lake Erie at some point with a monument. Why would the northern states have these monuments to groups to the Confederacy that broke away from the Union?
Well, part of it is because the spirit of reconciliation, not wanting to be vindictive about that. And more recently, I just think people don't really know much about the history of this. And so the fact is that most people don't know much about the Civil War. And what most people do know about the Civil War, especially if people are Civil War buffs, they know about the military side of the Civil War. I mean, there are countless books about not just Gettysburg, but like the first day of Gettysburg, the second day of Gettysburg, the third day of Gettysburg. I mean, there are literally volumes written by people on the minutiae of military movements. And that's not that, I'm not saying that those things aren't important and they're not interesting, but they completely ignore the social and political context of the Civil War. As I said, wars are not fought in a vacuum. They're not fought for fun. They're fought, as Clausewitz, I know it's a cliche, said that war is the extension of politics by other means. And and I think we need to put those reasons front and center instead of playing with guns and buttons and other things that a lot of people like to focus on.
Just a couple more real quick. Tal Goldhammer asks, do you believe that Black voices have been ignored by both the North and the South in this debate through history? And if so, they'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on specific reasons why, aside from racism in general.
Yeah, I think that by and large, Black voices have been marginalized in this conversation because oftentimes the supporters of these monuments will dismiss Black voices as marginal or angry or vindictive. And so they're, and because, as you might expect, Black voices are pretty much on one side of this debate. And so I think they have been pretty marginalized. I think they have been brought more to the center. Now, some of you might recall that during the summer, when there were a lot of protests around the country, support for Black Lives Matter actually spiked. Support for Black Lives Matter went to the 60 to 70%. And then it came down again, where a lot of people began to identify Black Lives Matter with Antifa and more violent movements when it was sort of co-opted by those. And so I'm not terribly optimistic that we're going to get to a place where at least pro-Confederate voices are going to be empathetic to Black voices in this conversation.
A question that piggybacks after that. Are you at least encouraged by the conversations that have been being had over the last 6 months over the summer and then even before then? Are you at least encouraged by that progress, or you think we are well far away from making substantial changes?
Yeah, this is I think Katie Hyduck's question. Hi, Katie. Good to see you, or not to see you, but you know what I mean. Yeah, I am a little bit encouraged. I mean, there's been some movement. When Nikki Haley was governor of South Carolina, she signed a bill to remove the Confederate state flag from the state house grounds. This year, right? Mississippi, of all places, replaced the Confederate flag on the state flag with, I think, a magnolia blossom, I think is their new state flag, which is great for Mississippi. So there's been some movement in that direction. I'm not terribly optimistic because, I don't know, we're in you don't need me to tell you that we're in a very divisive time in our country where at least some people in our country find it more useful to sow divisions than to unify the country. And as long as that motivation is present and it is rewarded at the ballot box and on television and so forth, people are going to use this to divide. So I think it's going to take a cultural shift in our country where we see each other as Americans and not as enemies, for us to kind of build on this in a more constructive way. Until then, I think, again, this is going to be weaponized, and some people are going to be receptive to the weaponization of these symbols.
And then our final question for the night, and I think it's really amazing that you're having a similar conversation with your students this year. And can you talk a little bit about why you feel it's important to have these kind of conversations in as we work towards unity in a respectful and having these conversations in a respectful manner? and what you try to impress on, especially the students that you have the privilege of teaching?
Well, we are an institution. I know that some people don't like this word, but a Jesuit institution like ours should be or is committed to social justice. And this is a social justice issue because many people are deeply offended by these symbols and the way that they are not just displayed, but they are exalted and given positions of respect. And I think that it's important for us, as I mentioned, there are people out there, many people who truthfully, or whether they're gaslighting, they'll say that these symbols don't represent hate to me. They represent heritage, my history. Now, on the other hand, you see in the background there's a guy flying the Nazi flag. Nobody would say that about the swastika, right? That, hey, I'm German, it's my history, I don't hate Jews. Yet we say that about the Confederate flag. Now, again, the Confederate flag is much older, goes much further back into history. So that's why I conceded that there may be sincere people out there of goodwill who really don't see the Confederate flag as a symbol of hatred. But as I said before, I think that's a failure of empathy. And I think having this conversation is an invitation, an opportunity for us to empathize for people for whom some of the people who fly Confederate flags might not have a lot of contact with, might not have a lot of conversation with, and might have low opinions of. And so I think that this is an opportunity, if done in the right way, to create a more of a culture of empathy and listening. Again, that requires a lot, and I just don't know if we're not there now for sure, and I don't know if we're going to get there.
Well, Dan, thank you so much for taking time out of your evening today to talk with us about this incredibly important issue that's going on within our society right now. We are incredibly fortunate to have you within our community to teach both our students and our alums about this important topic. And again, we just thank you for taking some time tonight to be with us.
Yeah, it was really my pleasure. I just want to give a shout out to Jean Claridge, who I see there in the chat. And I'm sorry, I didn't follow the chat closely, but it looks like there's a lot of questions that we just didn't get to, and I'm sorry about that. I'd be happy to, if you wanted to shoot me an email. I can't promise I'd respond to it right away. We're pretty busy around here, but I definitely try to get to it. So I apologize for not addressing all the questions, but yeah, this was really my pleasure. And I want to thank everybody for attending. I think that's great. It really is a good sign. I know a lot of you are alums, and we're just lucky to have you. And I'm just delighted to do this. So yeah, thank you very much.
Well, Dan, if you're okay with it, why don't I take the questions? I'll download the chat file and can send you a couple of them over.
Yeah.
Make it a little bit easier.
That'd be great. Yeah, cool.
Okay. Well, before we say goodnight, I wanted to let you all know about some other programs that we have available for our community. On Sunday, November 1st, JCU board member, Father Mark Henninger of the Society of Jesus will lead us through a Visio Divina, which is an ancient form of Christian prayer in which we allow our hearts and imaginations to enter into a sacred image in silence to see what God might have to say to us. Father Henninger will guide us through prayer and reflection using various pieces of art, focusing on the lives of saints and the beauty of life and resurrection as part of John Carroll's annual All Saints and All Souls Day remembrances. We're also proud to launch another new initiative, our Alumni Author Series. The Alumni Author Series is part of JCU's Lifelong Learning Initiative program, and it will provide John Carroll University a platform to feature alumni authors and their works. We invite you to join Nicole Spindler, class of 19, as she discusses her book, Beyond Life's Moments, which takes readers on a journey of self-growth to learn how to thrive throughout and beyond life's challenges or setbacks. More information on these programs and the recordings for all of our previous programs can be found on our website, jcu.edu/alumni. As a reminder, registration for these programs and many more is free. Finally, please consider a charitable gift to John Carroll in support of our students, faculty like Dr. Kilbride, and the entire JCU community. If you've already made a gift this year, thank you for your generosity. And if you have not, please join me in supporting JCU so that we can continue to deliver an outstanding education for our current and future Blue Streaks. Thank you, good night, stay well, and stay safe.